After a slight delay, we're back in business. Welcome back. This is CHSF 2106. You know how we do it. Chapter 5. We're going to be looking at today this idea of physical and cognitive development in childhood. Okay, so we're going a little bit back to the biology, but really looking at this idea of how these changes in the kind of cognitive structures and processes of the brain manifest in these behavioral things that we see and how we engage and see children play and stuff like that. So we're going to get into all this today, and welcome. I'm excited to be back at it, and let's get into it. Cheers. So as the children get older and we start to see these changes, the idea is sort of if we understand how these happen in this kind of interlocked complexity, right? Some of the changes that we're seeing are physical, some of them are cognitive, some of them are emotional, some of them are social, but it's really just all the same kid. We're just looking at different layers or levels of analysis. Parents and educators who clearly understand how young children develop can play an active role in creating programs that foster their natural interest in learning rather than stifling it, right? And it's like that's what so many of you should be interested in, right? A lot of you are either interested in early childhood psych or you're interested in kind of this idea of family and child development in more of a teaching scenario. And from both those scenarios, it's like the more you understand the biocognitive system within the individual you're trying to support, the more you're going to be able to support them. During the preschool years, both boys and girls slim down as the trunk of the body lengthens, right? So as the middle of the body lengthens and the baby gets like a little bit less top heavy, because when the baby's born, obviously the head proportionally is very big. So although the head is somewhat large for the body, by the end of the preschool years, most children have lost that kind of top heavy look of the toddler. Body fat also starts to slow, steady decline during the preschool years. The chubby baby face starts to look more lean, right? And as the baby sort of growing, as we kind of say, kind of growing into themselves, they're kind of filling out. The period of middle and late childhood involves this slow, consistent growth. This is a period of calm before the rapid growth spurts of adolescence, right? So puberty is going to be the next stage we're going to be looking at. So it's like there's this massive rapid development early, and then there's sort of childhood where that's kind of, it's really interesting if you're looking at it from nature and nurture. Now it's like, okay, now you've developed to this point, now let's throw you off the social world for a bunch of years before that, and have, as Piaget would say, your accommodation and assimilation processes. You're trying to make sense of your social reality, and then we're going to put you next, and this is sort of preparing you for this next huge change, which is going to be puberty. During the elementary school years, children grow an average of 7 centimeters a year until the age of 11, where the average child is just under 1.5 meters tall. Muscle mass and strength also increase during these years as the child's baby fat starts to decrease. The loose movements and knocky knees of early childhood give way to more improved muscle tone, right? So you see this huge increase in athletic ability or coordination. Thanks to both heredity and exercise, children double their strength capacity during these years. Now, obviously, these growth patterns are going to change between kids and have variation, but again, with a lot of these things in a course like psychology or a course related to anatomy or whatever, it's like you're going to be saying, like, this is usually how it is, and there's variations to both sides in almost every situation to differing degrees. But that doesn't still mean that there's something we can learn from studying sort of the baseline or what tends to be the case, and then how deviation from that tends to occur. All right, I hope this is fun. I miss doing these. I like doing these. Don't have to say that every single presentation, but Nipsing, yeah, you're got a special place with me. All right, anyways, enough of that. Next slide. So one of the other really interesting things about how all this development is happening is that, I should throw these points up. So if you're writing your notes, you'll see the part that where my camera's over, it says like the frontal lobe known as the prefrontal cortex. So it just says frontal lobe known and that's what's covered there. But this idea that the physical development in the brain is happening, and this brain and nervous system are changing significantly, and it's so fascinating to think of the relationship between the brain and nervous system, right? If we're saying that the brain is, or your brain cells are neurons, nerve cells in your head, in this localized system we call your brain. And it sounds weird saying that, except that we just looked at that video about octopus, right, where it was talking about, well, what if those neurons are distributed throughout the arms, and it's a distributed mind, not a localized mind. Okay, but since today we're talking about humans, sorry to laugh at my own thing, but since today we're talking about humans, I should start this slide over, or should I keep going? Alright, for you, I'm going to keep going. We'll keep going, even though that was a weird example, but whatever. It's like, no, it's actually not that weird to think that how the brain represents itself in this octopus in this different way has relevance for our understanding what a neuron is and how the nervous system is connected to the brain. The overall size of the brain is not changing dramatically, but the patterns within it are, right? So if you were to take the brain and put it in water and displace water, like to see its volume, the actual volume is going to stay relatively consistent. The complexity of the connections within is what's increasing at this rapid pace. Although physical growth is very obvious, it's the unseen changes in the brain and the nervous system that are especially significant in preparing children for advances that are going to come later in both terms of cognition and in terms of language. Okay, so it's these nervous system, brain system interconnections that are kind of happening under the waves, but that are going to be paving the way for their more advanced use of language and higher end cognition down the road. This increase in maturation of the brain, combined with opportunities to increase a widening world, contribute to the children's emerging cognitive abilities. Although the brain does not grow as rapidly during childhood as during infancy, it does undergo remarkable changes. By repeatedly obtaining brain scans of the same children for up to 4 years, researchers have found that children's brains experience rapid, distinct spurts of growth. Okay, so that's an important thing, right? To think that the brain kind of has these spurts of growth. It's not like it's like the opposite of spurts would be to say that it's like this constant development 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's like, no, it's like 5, 10, 15, 50, 150, 2,000. It's like it's not jumping at regular intervals. It's going in spurts. The overall size of the brain does not increase dramatically from age 3 to 5, like it says on the screen. What does dramatically change is the local patterns within the brain. The amount of brain material in some areas can nearly double in as little as a year. Now, okay, so then there's this like race to create, and then there's this race to prune, right? If you think of a bonsai tree, it's like the bonsai tree grows, and then you prune off the parts that you don't want so that it grows nicely. This dramatic loss of tissue as unneeded cells are pruned, and the brain continues to reorganize itself. This is reminiscent. This is reminiscent. I almost got all poetic there on you, but I may as well. This is reminiscent of a sculptor who chips away the unneeded material to produce a refined work of art within. From 3 to 6 years of age, the most rapid growth in the brain takes place in the part of the prefrontal lobe known as the prefrontal cortex, the front of your head. Prefront, in front of the front. Leading researchers in developmental cognitive neuroscience have proposed that the prefrontal cortex likely orchestrates the functions of many other regions during development. So it's like this part is in a rush to get finished, and then it sort of takes over. It's like an orchestra. The brain functions better with an excellent conductor. All right, that's a decent metaphor. But okay, next slide. So I always say this to my students, especially like I was going to say my Constructivism students, but I want to make this point because I know you've heard this term before, right? And if you've taken a bunch of psych classes, you've heard of the prefrontal cortex. You know it's prefrontal. You know it's the front of your brain, and sometimes just breaking down the root of the language, right? That it's in front of the front. This is the most advanced, newest, evolutionarily speaking part of your brain. Right, and we know that, so less diffuse meaning less like moving out and more diffuse. So diffuse would be like if you pour water on the table and it like spreads out and falls down. It's like diffuse is kind of like spreading out things, doing its own thing. Focal activation means now you're starting to see, as the person's getting closer to 30, more and more focused activation, right? Like doing very specific functions, right? So it's like this brain, because remember, we're going all the way back from the biological beginnings presentation, where we're basically initially one cell that then becomes multiple cells, it becomes multiple cells, it becomes multiple cells, and then they start spreading out and doing different things and diffusing and creating this kind of generalized, and then getting more and more specific, right? And it's like the prefrontal cortex is like the most specific part of your body almost. It's a really weird way of kind of saying it, and I freestyled that, but it sort of is, because it's the most human thing about you in some ways. I don't know, that's a weird comment too, but total brain volume stabilizes by the end of late childhood, but significant changes in various structures and regions of the brain continue to occur. As children develop, activation in some brain areas increases, while it decreases in other areas. One shift in activation that occurs is from diffuse, so diffuse means like we were saying, kind of spread out or large regions, to focal, which means like, think of focal as being the same root word as focus. The focal point, the focused on point. So sorry, I'll just read that part again. One shift in activation that occurs, so activation, again, like let's not overcomplicate the language. Activation just means where activity is happening, right? So one change, an easier way to say the sentence is, one change that we see in activity is from this kind of general stuff to more specific stuff, that specific point I was making before. So again, this is the last time I'll read this, but just to get this sentence clear. One shift in activation that occurs is from diffuse large areas to more focal small areas. In one study, researchers found less diffusion and more focal activation in the prefrontal cortex between 7 and 30-year-olds. So as you get older, more focal. This shift in activation was accompanied by an increased efficiency in things like cognitive performance, especially cognitive control, right? Which involves being able to like stay paying attention even when you don't want to, being able to have cognitive flexibility, being able to, well, cognitive control. That's one reason why like older kids are better at delayed gratification, because a little kid doesn't have a lot of cognitive control. It's like if my daughter sees there's a toy sitting wrapped on the desk that has her name on it, and I tell her just watch a movie and you can open it after, there's no way she's gonna be like, okay, and go watch like a 2-hour movie. She's gonna be like, no, how about we check the present right now, because it's like the cognitive control needed to tell yourself to not focus on that a million times during that 2 hours is a lot. Cognitive control is a very interesting concept, and of course it has ramifications and manifests as adults too. It's like, think about it in terms of our own mental health. It's like, you could almost slip into the term discipline, but it's like cognitive discipline and cognitive freedom. That should be the topic of another lecture, but yeah, cognitive freedom and cognitive, what was the first thing I said? Discipline. Okay, so the main point, and I'm going to finish this slide and move on, but the main point is this idea of a shift from more kind of big area development to very focused development. And it sort of makes sense, right, that as you get older and as the sort of building blocks are there, that your brain moves into this like more specified, higher end construction. Oh, I forgot to put one sec. Let me get our tunes back on. If you're wondering why I have a little bit of tunes on in the background, it's because my computer has a bit of a hum, and I found in some of the early videos there's this like kind of annoying hum, so I'm trying to do a little audio doctoring. Let me know if it's too distracting, but since I'm co-recording it, I can't take it out, but I could stop doing it. Okay, anyways, so myelinization, or this idea of as these neural networks are forming, then there's this coding, right? This myelinization, this fat-like substance that provides almost, I've used the comparison of like the plastic on the outside of a wire cord. And that this is actually, when I use the term there, eye hand. You throw me a ball and boom, I catch it in my hand. And it's like my wife, when we play ping pong and in the garage, and my wife, you'd think it's weird, but but if I have a ping pong ball in my hand and I'm like, Julie, I can be like, wham, and hit it, because we've played so many times that when it's like her turn, I can hit it really hard and like a laser, and she can catch it in her hand. And it's like her eye hand for catching ping pong. Mine too. It's like, because we play a lot, right? And it's like, oh, it's your serve, and she'll hit it back to me and boom. But what's happening there? And if you play any sport, you have that. Or if you're play musical instruments, I don't know why I'm pretending I'm doing a trombone or something, but, or if you're an artist, right? Or if you ride horseback, or if you're an outdoors person and you know how to start good campfires, it's like, well, what's actually going on there between your brain and your, we call that kind of stuff eye hand, but that's actually like kind of a simplistic thing. What your eye sees the ball and your hand just catches it. It's like, that's actually a complex neural circuitry that's heavily myelinated, and basically meaning the establishment pattern has been wired and then protected. In addition to changes in patterns of activation, myelination continues throughout childhood. Recall that myelination is this process by which the axons, bracket, nerve fibers that carry away signals from the cell body, on bracket, are covered with this layer of fat cells that increases the speed and efficiency that the information travels through the nervous system. So that these connections are made and then reinforce. That coating on the outside of the cord makes the information travel at a higher quality and at a better, it's like if you have a better quality HDMI cord, it just, the transfer of information is better. This myelination is important in the development of a number of abilities, but the timing of myelination varies across brain regions, right? So this is interesting. It's like, this isn't all, it's not like your eyes, you're born and your eyes are at level 1, and then after a month they're at level 2, and your ears are at level 2, and everything's moving up at the same leveling. It's like the example that I'm going to show here is the idea that like you basically have adult vision by 1, but you don't have adult hearing until like 5 or 6. So that's pretty interesting, right? It's like the myelination. And what do we mean when we say adult? I mean, like, by the time the baby's about 6 months, their vision's at about 20/40, so about half of what someone that we would consider strong vision adult is, 20/20, right? But by about a year, they're about 20/20. But they're not 20/20, or not 20/20, but they're not what we would consider adult level hearing until they're 6. So let me talk about that as actually being a reflection of this difference in speed of myelination. For example, myelination in areas of the brain related to eye-hand coordination and isn't complete until about 4. Myelination in the, so maybe I have, well, that was just a gong on the song, sorry, that was a bit loud. But I'll give that, maybe I already told you this, or maybe it's a little later, I'm a little bit thrown about, I want to make that eye comparison, because the eye is 1 year and hearing's about 6. But here's another interesting example, that the area of the brain related to eye-hand coordination isn't complete until about 4. So by the time, and you see this with kids in sports, it's like, once they get to like 5, the difference between a team of like 6-year-olds and a team of 4-year-olds is massive. And one of the reasons is that just those signals are going quicker. Right? Myelination is absolutely connected with athletic development. Myelination or the circuitry behind it. Myelination in the areas of the brain related to focusing attention isn't complete until kind of the end of middle or late childhood. So think about that. It's like one of the reasons why older kids perform better cognitively than younger kids. Some of it is because they've been to school more and learn more. Some of it is just because their brain's at a later stage of myelination and they're able to maintain focus, or what we could call attention, longer. So to say that it's just that they're smarter because of what they learned at school, it's like, well, okay, yeah, that's an important developmental step, but it's also this changing brain also. Myelination of many aspects of the prefrontal cortex, especially those involved in certain types of higher thinking, is not complete until late adolescence or emerging adulthood. And you've heard this about how like risk-taking behavior really goes down in like your mid-20s when the part of your brain that weighs consequences is fully formed. Researchers at McGill University in Concordia discovered that early music lessons before the age of 7 can have a long-lasting effect on the brain. I should get Evie into music. She actually is a weird side note, but she is kind of interested in. I have a guitar and a banjo, but she wants to learn the banjo. I don't know how to play either, but my wife's dad is a musician and passed along some instruments, so I'm trying to learn banjo. It's kind of weird, but I have a Hawaiian guitar too, if you know what that is. The later two groups were matched on. Sorry, so let me start again. Researchers compared 3 groups: individuals with no music lessons, individuals who started music lessons before 7, and people that started after 7. Okay, so basically people that never learned music, people that started before they were 7, and people that started after 7. The later two groups were matched on years of experience. Participants performed a behavioral task that measured timing as their brains were scanned using fMRI machines. The groups were then the group that started musical training before 7 outperformed the other 2 groups on behavioral tasks and had a greater connectivity in the part of their corpus callosum that connects the motor regions in the right and left hemispheres of the brain. Think about that. The kids, let me say it again, the kids that started earlier had a better connection between the right and left hemispheres of their brain. Greater connectivity in the corpus callosum, the part that connects the 2 hemispheres. That's one of the reasons music's good for people, is and why it's like your favorite music feels. Well, there's such a psychology of music experience. Yeah, it's an interesting whole field of research. So as children move their legs with more confidence and carry themselves more purposefully, moving around their environment, things start to become more automatic. And this is actually one of the more interesting things about humans, is like how, and for life in general, is how like we start to automate behavior, right? It's like you start to play soccer, and after you play soccer longer and longer and longer, you have to think less and less and less about what part of your foot to use to touch the ball and how to corral or control a pass, and what to do if you're taking it off your chest or off your leg or if you're trying to headbutt the ball. And it's like all these moves start to become your skill set of what a soccer player is. And it's like as that's happening, that's like we can consider that the development of your kind of skill set or your skills. So we can break this into kind of 2 layers. And in psychology, you've heard these words before, obviously, but this idea of like gross motor skills, and then on the next slide we'll talk about more fine motor skills. But these big things like walking and crawling and being able to kick and being able to lift things and all that kind of stuff. Around age 3, children enjoy simple movements such as hopping and jumping and running back and forth just for the sheer delight of doing it. They delight in showing that they can run across the room and jump, and it's like I remember that stage a lot with Evie. It's like she was like kind of learning that she could do things. At 4, children are still enjoying the same kind of activities, but they've become more adventurous. They scramble over jumbo gym logs or jungle gyms as they display their athletic ability. Although they've been able to climb stairs with 1 foot on each step for some time, they're starting to be able to come downstairs that way, right? So for a lot of kids, they're able to go upstairs before they're able to go downstairs. Or for a lot of kids though, like I can remember Evie would walk upstairs but then like go on her butt down the stairs, because actually going downstairs requires this like momentary drop of weight and reposition. You're kind of recatching yourself. It's actually a lot harder on your knees. It's a lot more higher level coordinated skill than going up, or you're pushing off. It's a different thing to drop and cushion. Okay, next. Okay, so I'm just going to set this up a bit. So this, you can put these points down in your notes though. But so this is at 5, but I'm going to move back a bit. By the time the child's 3, they're able to start to pick up the tiniest objects between their thumb and forefinger. And they maybe have even a little bit earlier. When the 3-year-old plays with a simple jigsaw, though, they're more rough with the pieces, even though they recognize that the whole fits a piece, they're not as precise at positioning that piece in the right spot of like a puzzle or something. By the time the child's 4, their fine motor coordination has improved substantially and they're much more precise. Continued improvement of this fine motor skill during middle and later childhood is associated with this increased myelination of the central nervous system. Right by 5, the hand, arm, and body all move together with a better command of the eye-hand. This improved fine motor skill in middle and late childhood is associated with this increased myelination of the central nervous system. By the time the kid reaches about 12, a lot of their manipulative skills, like ability to use tools, is at a level similar to adult. All right, and we actually see girls mature faster in this area. So one of the big ideas, and I've said a bunch of times, like Piaget is the most important developmental psychologist. He had this idea of the pre-operational. So think of an operation as like, so remember his first stage was sensory motor. So we're not in sensory motor anymore. Now we're in this pre-operational. So to understand what pre-operational, before operational means, we should talk about what operational is about to mean, right? And formal and concrete operational are the last two, or the next two stages. And he actually had another stage called messianic, which is interesting because it's not talked about a lot. That his idea was that people in their late teens, early 20s can sometimes have this religious aspect of development. Anyways, if you typed in Piaget messianic, you'd find it. Not often taught in like a child development course, but that would actually be an awesome project idea if one of you wanted to do it. You'd find it on the internet in a second. So operation means like being able to do something. So say if I like take water in one glass and I pour it into another glass that's taller and thinner, and I ask you like, is this more water? And you're like, well, no, because I saw you pour it from this. And I can in my head be like, well, that's the same amount of water, it just looks different. And it's like, okay, well, all that thinking was all mental operations, right? So the ability to do a forwards and backwards operation, like almost like a math equation in your head, but we're not literally talking about math. So Piaget thought that in this early stage, and he noticed his stuff really interestingly, and I'm going to jump ahead of my point a bit, but he worked with this guy named Theodore Simon, and it's really interesting. So this is in 1873 is when that guy was born. So their work together, I'm going to guess, is like the early kind of turn of the century, and that would make sense with Piaget's other work. And this is early in Piaget's career, so maybe even a little bit a few years earlier. And he's working for this guy, right? This guy's last name's Simon, and Simon's working with this other guy whose last name's Binet. And Simon and Binet got hired by the French military to create a test that they could give to people that were joining the French army to basically figure out, are these people smart enough to be like useful soldiers? And this is where the IQ test comes from. The Binet and Simon, those two people's last names. Yeah, Binet Simon intelligence scale, or IQ, intelligent score. So then eventually Binet comes to the States, and at Stanford they keep giving the test to people every year, and so now you hear it called the Stanford Binet IQ quotient, right? That's what, like, when people say IQ, that's actually what they mean. So, okay, so now think about this, how this is interesting, right? So Piaget is working as a researcher for this guy that's trying to develop this test, and he's trying to figure out, like, what are these like standardized questions that we can ask to like rate people's intelligence. And one thing Piaget starts to notice is, so I'll put here, while conducting intelligence tests with Theodore Simon, one of the creators of the Binet-Simon intelligence scale, IQ, Piaget didn't simply record when a child made an error. Instead, he was captivated by their responses, like the type of wrong answer, and noted that a child responded in qualitative different ways when they were younger versus when they were older. So what he was basically interested in is not just if they got it right, but if they got it wrong, how did they get it wrong? And it seemed that kids of certain ages seemed to get questions wrong in the same way. They weren't taking a certain thing into account, or it was the way they were looking at it, or they were taking their opinion too much into account, or it was like the errors didn't seem to be random, they seemed to be stage-like. remember, he's about to come out with this idea of stages of cognitive development, which is, maybe the most important idea in developmental psychology. So now we're going to focus on, we're saying that this stage is classified and defined as pre-operational, before operational. Okay, and so say if you're like, okay, Mike, can you give us in really specific ways, how is it before operational? What is specific about early childhood thinking that's different than later childhood thinking? Like, what's the difference between the thinking of, somebody at 3 versus someone at 8? And what I would say is, okay, well, let me answer that question with 3 concepts. Okay, so we're going to talk now about this idea called egocentrism, animism, and conservation, and I'll go through them one at a time. So if you look at this, you think of, in early psychology, some of the early psychologists called psychology ego psychology, the study of the ego, the identity. I'm trying not to use the word self because self and ego are different. But this part of Mike that's Mike, that's not my thoughts, or that identifies as Mike, and that's the ego, and that the ego, and so egocentric means seeing everything from that centralized position, right? So centration is focusing attention on characteristics on one thing to the exclusion of others, that you're focusing on what are you centering on, that you're not seeing everything, you're centering on certain things, and you're centering on things in how they relate to you, right? So it's almost like saying, like, young kids are at this scenario where it's hard for them to take kind of other perspectives. They're seeing things almost over from their perspective, and you can actually test this by this scenario where they create this model of the mountain, right? And then they show the kid the mountain, and they have chairs at 4 different locations around this table, right? So that's like a table with these 3 mountains, and one of them has a cross on it, one of them has a red cylinder on it. Then you put the child at different parts of or on different chairs, right? So you have one on each side, and the top and bottom. Then you get the kid to sit there. Then you put like a doll or something on one of the other chairs, and you ask them what you think the doll sees, what they think the doll sees. Piaget and his student Indler in 1969 initially studied children's egocentrism by devising this thing called the 3-mountain task. A child walks around a table with a model of the mountains, becomes familiar with what the mountains look like from different perspectives, and they see that there are different objects on the mountains. The child's then seated on one side of the mountain. The experimenter moves a doll to a different location around the table. At each location, the child is asked to select from a series of photos the one that most accurately reflects the view that the doll is seeing. Children that are in the pre-operational stage will often pick their own view rather than the doll's view. They must see what I see, right? And failing to take into account that someone looking from a different angle is going to see something different, right? And you say, well, why are you failing to take that into account? Because because of this egocentric tendency, right? That is not saying anything about that they're egotistical or any different word, right? Completely different word. Egocentric means they can't help but see things from their perspective. I hope this like light set up and like the little bit of music or whatever is okay, because I don't know, it certainly makes me more relaxed and makes it fun, makes it kind of just unique, or not unique, but just like, I don't know, different. If you go into my daughter's room, she's got like her bed and stuff, and then her dollhouse and her like little table that she uses, and then she has like a couch where there's like, it's all covered in like stuffed animals and stuff. And if you were to pick one up and be like, what's this stuffed animal's name, and tell the story about it, and my daughter would be able to tell you that stuffed animal's name and tell you about how it relates to the other ones. And it's like they're almost all alive. It's like this idea of animism, or this idea that like things that aren't alive are alive, or that there's like a story behind them. And this is this like tendency of kids, and this animism, another what Piaget thought was a limitation of pre-operational thought, is this belief that inanimate, or which means not alive. Think of what the word animation means, to animate, to bring a drawing to life. So inanimate, not alive, objects have these giving inanimate objects lifelike qualities and seeing them as capable of action or being able to talk. Now, it's not like my daughter, if you went up to her and were like, do you really honestly think that this doll can talk? She's like, no, of course not. But like in the game, the doll can talk. It's like, let kids have dramatic, imaginative play. It's very important. I know that you all think that, and it's not like you're saying not to do that, but it's one of the most important things for kids. A young child who shows animism is failing to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate occasions for implying a human perspective. Animism explains why a 4-year-old might get angry at a swing that hits them and why they might believe that their doll has feelings. So this word conservation is kind of like, if you think of conservation, how you would usually probably hear it in North Bay is probably around the forests or whatever. It's like usually used as a word that talks about the environment, and it's like this idea of like things conserving it or not letting it go away or maintaining it or whatever. And it's like in this sense what it means is that like the amount stays the same even though you're changing the where it is, right? So in this place it means like if you look at that top picture, if you have A and B, you see that they're clearly the same amount. Pouring B into a cup C doesn't change the amount of liquid. Alright, but a lot of kids, my daughter might be smart, or might be kind of at the stage enough, I almost said smart enough, but again, that's not the right word. She might be at this stage to notice this now, but when she was a bit younger, she'd probably think that that tall glass had more in it. Even if in this experiment you show the kid it, right? You show them those two things, those 2 glasses of orange juice, right? That kid sitting in front of the 2 glasses of orange juice, and then you pour one of the glasses into that huge beaker, and it's going to look more because it's more vertical. And you ask them which one has more, even though they just saw that they have the same. And Piaget found that like kids' age is the age of the kid is very predictive of how they'll answer that. Conservation. So if you look at this image, it sort of just kind of highlights it more. So it's like there's different ways you could do this experiment. You could show the kid these like 8 circles. 2 identical rows of objects are shown to the child who agrees that they have the same number, and then you spread them out, the ones on the right, and the child's likely to think that the balls on the right, there's more because they're taking up more space. It's like it's almost like a visual optical illusion. It's same with the matter there. You take 2 identical balls of clay, show them to the child, flatten one out and lengthen it, and ask him which one has more. It's going to be hard for them not to fall into the trap of saying the longer one. Or you take the 2 sticks and put them beside each other, they're obviously the same size, and you just off-center them, and the one that seems to reach further from the kid, it's like... And what he found was that the likelihood of getting that wrong was age dependent to a degree, right? Like if it's not going to be a perfectly, but more enough so that it seemed like kids were predictably going through age-related stage changes. Right, so then later he's going to come up with this model of the stages of cognitive development. Okay, so I want to talk about social constructivism, and construction as in like constructing or building something, and not to be confused with the idea that you sometimes hear people saying like things are all social constructions, like this like pure subjectivist philosophy. This kind of constructivist is actually talking about how the brain is constructed through social interactions with the environment. Like Piaget, Vygotsky was a constructionist, but Vygotsky's theory is a social constructionist approach that emphasizes the social context of learning and the construction of knowledge through social interactions. Right, and we talked about this idea of like a learning buddy and like having someone model to the child what the next level's like, and that's like this really effective way to help the child reach higher levels of achievement by instead of having somebody that's in grade 2 being taught by somebody that's in university. It's like that gap is so huge that unless you're really good at knowing how that kid's processing, it's easy to not meet them head on, whereas like a kid that's just a little bit better than them kind of is mirroring what the next step looks like, and that zone or that distance between them is cultivating this learning experience, right? So he called that zone, that proximity means the distance between, so that there's a right zone, a right distance, that if you can get that zone, that distance zone between people, the right, it can help their development, the zone of proximal development. That tasks that are too difficult for a child to master alone can be learned with the guidance or assistance of an adult more skilled than the child. That's an easier way to say it for sure. In Vygotsky's view, children's cognitive development depends on the tools provided by society, and their minds are shaped by the cultural context in which they live. Vygotsky's belief in the importance of social influence on the child's cognitive development is reflected in his concept of ZPD, or the zone of proximal development, or basically this idea that there's what the kid can do and then there's what the kid can do with help, and what the kid can do with help is a higher level, and the lower limit is what they could do by themselves, and then the upper limit is what they could do with the assistance of someone trying to help them. So I'll just read this. The lower limit of ZPD, zone of proximal development, is the level of skill reached by the child working independently. The upper limit is a level of additional responsibility or achievement the child could accept with the assistance of an able instructor or with someone showing them. The ZPD captures a child's cognitive skills that are in the process of maturing and that can be accomplished with the assistance of a more skilled person. This is from Holtzman's work in 2016. So it's this idea of or from his writing, and it's this idea that this is actually sort of what we mean when we say people have untapped potential. What's that mean? It means what they are and what they could be is both contained within them, but just because it's contained within them doesn't necessarily insist that it's expressed. And that people in certain environments, and you've been like that, and even if you play sports, it's like all of a sudden you're playing sports you're on a line or on a shift with certain other players, and you can play better when you're with them, or when you're playing music, or when you're acting, or when you're whatever. It's like some people when you're having conversations, some people you're just synced in. Right, that zone of sync, that zone of proximal development, he called it. It's like not all learning partners are the same. Not all learning situations are the same. Different social contexts have different constructive effects on people. Closely linked to this idea of ZPD, or the zone of proximal development, is the concept of developmental scaffolding. And we talked about this earlier when we were talking about parent-child interactions really early in the course, but scaffolding is this idea. I have here these workers that are building something, and they make this temporary steel structure around it so that they can work on it, because obviously if you're building the floor on the highest level, there's nothing to stand on, so you're working on beside the building sort of, and then eventually pulling away. And it's that's like the reading buddy that's helping the child learn, and then eventually the reading buddy steps away and the child can just read. The building's just there. And the scaffolding's moving and changing up as the building's getting bigger, and so the development of the building is being reflected in this continual moving of the scaffolding. Is the scaffolding's this zone of proximal development. It's changing with the building. Scaffolding means changing the levels of support as this developmental process continues. Over the course of a teaching session, a more skilled person will adjust the amount of guidance to fit the child's current performance. When the child's learning a new task, the skilled person may use direct instruction, but as the child's competence increases, less guidance is given. One study found that scaffolding techniques that heightened engagement, encouraged direct exploration, and facilitated sense-making, such as guided play, improve the acquisition of geometry knowledge in 4- and 5-year-olds. Right, so that was just a specific study looking at how it could increase learning something like math. Right, and they're saying that the more that the scaffolding, scaffolding techniques made the kids feel more engaged. They were more directly explorative, trying to learn new things. And they facilitated sense making, understanding it. It's that's a pretty good increase to the learning environment. So Vygotsky thought, okay, how do you use this idea? Okay, how do you use this idea of the zone of proximal development if you're, say, a teacher or a youth leader or a coach? Well, his first idea is that to help somebody learn to get better at something, it's really important that you have an accurate view of where they're at. So if I'm trying to help you get better at, say, writing, the more I know about where you're specifically at, the more I can tailor towards that, right? So saying skilled helpers give tasks in varying difficulties to determine the best level of instruction. So at some level, if I was to try to help you read, I have to figure out like, okay, can you read this? Can you read this? And kind of establish your reading level so I know where do we start the developmental process. So assessing where they're at is kind of key. This is where, you know, the counseling comparison to this would be something like Carl Rogers' idea of having your therapies very person-centered or client-centered or group-centered or whatever, meaning just that like we're not using some generalized theory for everything. We're starting where the person's at. Assess the child's ZPD. Use that in teaching. That teaching begins near the upper limit, right? It's like if I know what you are and what you're capable of, say this is, just to make the math easy, say this is 50 and this is 100, I want to be aiming you at like 90. I want to not be stressing you out, but I want to be asking you to do a little more than you think you can. Again, whether I'm a coach, whether I'm a teacher, whether I'm teaching you reading, whether I'm teaching you writing, whether I'm teaching you how to kick a soccer ball, be an effective member on a high-functioning team defense. Using skilled peers, right? So really the best way to teach your kid how to play soccer is to, you know, help them with the things that they need help with and then have them play with kids all the time, right? And especially kids that are better than them, because it's going to bring that out. What does that even mean, right? That's what Vygotsky was trying to get at. What does it mean to say like, well, if you spend all summer playing volleyball, just pick something random, with a bunch of people that are good at volleyball, the likelihood that you're better at volleyball after that is very high, right? Way more so than if it's just random people, skilled peers. And that can, if that instruction can be then placed within an environment where the person cares about what they're learning and they feel like it matters and that there's purpose attached to that, it's like, because you're providing some kind of chance to give kind of real world applicable meaning. That's kind of his idea. This is the secret to learning. Access for the level that they're at, then teach to the top of that, and then use skilled peers to help in that process and make it all within a narrative around purpose and meaning that's authentic and genuine. So Piaget and guys like Piaget and Vygotsky had interesting theories about and important ideas about how young children think and about how the children's thinking changes over time. But more recently, there's been a lot of research in this area that's called kind of information processing, which in that early presentation I had made the reference that kind of as computers started to become more and more common, people started to use that as a model for the mind, especially with things like memory. And I'm going to use that example in a second. When we talk about what attention is, if you could have in your notes, this idea of attention is basically this idea of like, what are you focusing? If you look at the power of your mind, and your mind is consisting of mental resources, it's focusing it on selected information, the ability to pay attention. And this ability to pay attention improves significantly during preschool, especially in two areas. Okay, and those two areas that improve are called executive. So decision making. So executive sort of means the decision making. Executive of a company is going to be the one person making like the top end decisions. Theoretically, the executive of the United States is the president, who theoretically should be making all the decisions. Executive means top end decision making. This involves planning actions, allocating attention to goals, directing, compensating for errors, monitoring progress on tasks. So it's basically like following the plan, being able to understand the sequences and things, being able to follow instructions and keep working on tasks. So that gets better. Also, their ability to do all those processes and maintain attention on it, which we call sustained or continued attention, vigilance, cognitive vigilance. You sometimes hear it called, which is just a more aggressive way of saying sustained attention. Yeah, by the time a child reaches middle childhood, they're able to sustain attention for much longer. Preschool sustained attention scores have been seen to be linked to higher likelihood of completing college and university at 25 years of age. Right, so that's interesting, that if you see the differences between kids and their ability to kind of stick to tasks, that's actually predictive of how the graduation rates in post-secondary school. So one sort of interesting way they've looked at this is what's called saliency. I should have done this for this slide. I should almost redo this slide and do it. But for Halloween, I was giving out candy. And so what we've done for the last few years is my wife will take Evelyn, and this year Evelyn and Charlotte, over to her mom's, and they kind of go with some of her sisters. And since we also want to give out candy, for the last few years I've kind of stuck back, and I'll put on the scary music, and I have a dinosaur mask that I wear and stuff. So anyways, you know, I have like a Raptors mask that looks like a dinosaur head, like from Jurassic Park, and then I wear a Raptors jersey and I call myself a Toronto Raptor. You can probably see how that works as a costume. So anyways, why was I saying that? Oh yeah, because I wanted to use this word salient. It's like if I was all of a sudden like, oh, let me get something, and I come back up and I have the Raptor head on, and you weren't really paying attention, you notice that right away because it's a huge change. If I duck down and super quickly change shirts to just a different green shirt with black writing that said something sort of similar, and it was also a circle, maybe it was basketball or something, it's like you probably wouldn't notice. The saliency is different, how new it is, how much it stands out. So this is an interesting thing, right? It's like if you have somebody giving kids direction, but the person giving direction is like, it's hard to focus on what they're saying. So in this scenario, they do it with a clown, right? And does the clown, being a clown, overwhelm the younger kids more than the older kids? Does it affect their ability to listen to the directions? So just think about that for a sec. So preschool children are likely to pay attention to things that stand out or that are salient, even when they're not relevant to solving a problem or a task. For example, if a flashy, attractive, colorful clown presents the directions for solving a problem, preschool children are likely to pay attention more to the clown than to the directions. But once kids reach about 6 or 7, their ability to attend more efficiently to the dimensions of the tasks that are relevant increases. Elements such as directions for solving the problem. This change seems to reflect a shift to a more cognitive control over attention, so that the child that's older is able to act less impulsively and with more reflection. So one way that younger kids thinking is different than older kids is that younger kids are more likely to the novelty of the situation to overwhelm their ability to stay focused, right? And that's really about this cognitive control, attention, being able to not be like, oh, squirrel, and distracted. Planfulness, now that's kind of this idea of like, so I have here, when experimenters ask children to judge two pictures, right? So I show you this picture and this picture and ask you what's different. That younger kids are more likely to try to look quick and give a quick response, whereas the kid gets older, they're more likely to start, if you're watching their eyes through like kind of eye motion recognition technology, you can see that where they're looking, and they're actually sort of like starting in the left corner, breaking down, coming down this side, then coming down here, then coming down here, just much more systematic or planful. Planfulness is a kind of not often used word, but it sort of makes sense, right? Like how much planning is involved in what they're doing, or how much are they just sort of doing. Elementary school children are more likely to systematically compare the details between the two pictures. The ability of preschool children to control and sustain attention is related to school readiness, right? So all this stuff is, and it sort of makes sense, right? That like paying attention is related to how well you do at school, because you can be very smart and able to do it, but can you focus that attention? And on the last slide we said attention is the focusing of mental resources. So short-term memory, I know we've already sort of touched on memory in this course, and you've probably taken intro psych courses that have been about memory, but I want to sort of place this within this developmental context. Right, if we look at memory as information retention, right, and that this information retention is a central part of cognitive growth, right, like a huge part of learning and sort of developing in school and all that is this cumulative knowledge piece, right? And how does this work in short-term memory? For information to be stored in long-term memory, the information must be first attended to, paid attention to, and then stored in short-term memory, and then hopefully transferred to long-term memory. Both short and long-term memory improve during childhood. right? Individuals retain information for about 30 seconds if there's no rehearsal. And this is like this idea that one of the most interesting things about your memory is what you don't remember, that you're driving down the street and you're seeing cars constantly and you're constantly forgetting the model and the size and what the driver looked like, and unless something catches your eye, right? Unless that saliency piece. Right? You see like a pink Cadillac. It's like, whoa, like an Elvis style pink Cadillac, right? Like it's like everyone would turn their head because it's like it's highly unique, highly salient. That was a really weird example, but it's a decent example of a salient car. So this ability to like focus attention. So I want to kind of really be making this point a bunch of times today, that it's easy to think that older kids are just, for lack of a better word, smarter than younger kids, and underestimate how much attention is playing a role, and that as the kids getting older, they're able to focus that ability more. So it's not just comparing potential misses the point a bit, because it's not just potential, it's also ability to focus potential. So if you just take a quick look at this graph, I thought it was kind of interesting. So it shows across the bottom axis, it shows the age, and then across the vertical axis, it shows like how many numbers can people remember in a row. So if I'm like 7, 8, 9, 3, 6, 1, 4, it's like I probably wouldn't even be able to tell you back what I just said because I'm talking and thinking what I'm going to say next, and that interferes with my ability to retain that information. And now that's almost 30 seconds ago, and it's like I know I said 8 and 7, and there's probably said 8, 4, 1. I can't even remember, right? But it's like if we were in a different setting and you were telling me to remember, and I wasn't also recording myself and seeing myself talking, it's like my ability to do that would be better. But that's an interesting point, right? That like, so say when the kid's 2, on average they can remember about 2. By the time they're 4, like 4. By the time they're 6, like kind of getting close to 5. By the time they're 10, they're at about 6. By the time they're an adult, me and you can tend to remember about 7, right? Which is historically the reason you always hear why phone numbers were 7 digits. It's like, especially if it's a 4 and then a 3 and then a 4 combo, it seems like our brain can remember that. It's probably why, well, it's why you'd have a lot more trouble now with everybody having different area codes and stuff. It's like 10 digits is a lot harder than 7. Notice that even adults sort of cap out around 7. It's not continual upward. You can kind of start to see the flattening out there already, especially since that scale is kind of weird because it goes by 2 until 12 and then all the way to adult. But that does show quite a plateau effect. And I know that you've all like obviously heard of working memory. You've probably all done like projects on it and stuff, but like I think what's really interesting to think of is obviously sometimes when we talk about working memory, we talk about things we learn and how that gets stored. And one thing I think that's fascinating about working memory that we don't talk about a lot or all the time is this idea of how it informs right now, and that like your ability to understand what I'm saying is your working memory. It's you bringing your knowledge of language obviously into the moment in the split second. Or if you know what split second means, you've heard that, compared it into somewhere in your deep in your file banks, it comes flying up. It in real time helps your interpretation of the in the moment spoken word. It's actually like completely mind-blowing that I'm making these sounds that I'm remembering in the moment mean certain things, and you're bringing them in and interpreting them in the moment. And this is all happening so fast that unless I'm specifically talking about it, we just totally take it for granted. We just hear each other's meaningful sounds. That's actually wild. It's like we have this like highly complex mental workbench. I got a workbench out in the garage with tools. It's like where you go to do work. It's like your mental workbench is where you do work. Your working memory, just to hammer the point a bit, is where we manipulate and assemble information to make decisions and solve problems and comprehend written and spoken language. This develops slowly. 8-year-olds hold the memory potential at about half the level of an adult. As this gets more powerful, more active, it gets better at modifying information, right? It's like if somebody's asking you a question, because think about something, if like, say all of a sudden we're talking about something and I say something about conservatism and liberalism in Canada, and you're like, well, what is the difference? And I have to hold those two ideas in my head and make points about how they're similar and different, and it's like, Some of that is memory work, some of that is like in the moment adaptation and contrast comparing, and it's like, and some of it is maybe trying to find an interesting example to highlight it, and it's all that's happening in real time in your working memory. British psychologist Alan Baddeley, 2013, defines working memory as a type of mental workbench where individuals manipulate and assemble information, make decisions, solve problems, comprehend written words, basically what I have there in spoken language. Working memory is being described as active, powerful, modifying information. Working memory involves bringing information to mind mentally, working with it or updating it, as like when you link one idea to another or understand something that you read before. So I thought you might find this interesting, that as selective attention increases, memory gets better. So there's this interest, and it sort of makes sense, right? If I was telling you, say I was like, okay, this is an emergency. You have to go to my house and find the secret key in the backyard and use that to blah blah blah. And the secret key is here. And I give you, and I'm like, are you paying attention? It seems like you're not paying attention. Why would you say that, right? Because we all know that, like, if you're telling someone something important and they're not paying attention, it's a problem. That paying attention is associated with remembering it. It's not surprising that long-term memory improves across childhood as a result of their getting better at this idea of selective attention, which improves their short-term memory capability and their working memory. Each of this development then fosters improvement in long-term memory, this relatively permanent, unlimited, at least theoretically, type of memory that increases with age during middle and late childhood. Children actively construct their memories so that knowledge, expertise, and the type of memory formed will influence long-term memory.